Hi, I'm Antonia. This is Universally Me. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Antonia Carlotta and check out my Patreon where I've got bonus content. First and foremost, I know it's been quite a few months since my last video, and I just want to say that in that time, I heard from so many of you guys here on YouTube, on Twitter and Instagram. I even had people reach out on Facebook and over email. I think anywhere you guys could find me, really, just letting me know how much you guys love my videos and how much my channel means to you. And I had a lot of messages asking when my next video was coming out. And I just want to let you guys know that all of those were so meaningful to me. It was really awesome to get those messages, to get those reminders of why my channel matters and that it is making a difference and it's really reaching people who care. So thank you guys so much. And now back to our regularly scheduled programming. It is impossible to talk about film in the 1930s without talking about the Hays Code or film censorship. I know that I've talked about it a little bit in some of my other videos. It came up in my Imitation of Life video. I think I talked about it in my Bela Lugosi videos and my Boris Karloff videos, but I realized that I don't think I ever explained what the Hays Code is. You can learn a lot about a film by knowing when it was made. If it was made before the code altogether, if it was made in what's known as the pre-code era, or if it's a code-approved film. The code was a really big deal, and once you learn it and you get it, it's gonna change the way that you look at movies. So today's video is all about the Hays Code. Let's start back in 1915 and set the scene. The film industry is exploding. Universal, for instance, has just opened Universal City in California, and people are just starting to understand the power and influence held by films. But because of this, people are just starting to worry about the power and influence held by films. The state of Ohio, for instance, formed a board that was to review all films that were going to be shown in the state. They planned to charge licensing fees to distributors, and they were going to arrest anybody showing unapproved films. The Mutual Film Corporation was a film distributor who fought against this censorship. They argued that it was a violation of their First Amendment right to free speech. Their case went up the courts, all the way to the Supreme Court, and believe it or not, the Mutual Film Corporation lost. The Supreme Court stated that moving pictures were a business, pure and simple, that they were subject to regulation just like any other industry, and that they weren't organs of public opinion or part of the press of the country. And this ruling really set the stage for the Hays Code to come in. But okay, so I've said the Hays Code a ton, I've set the scene, but I still haven't said what the Hays Code is. So the Hays Code, also known as the Motion Picture Production Code, was a set of censorship guidelines introduced to the industry in 1934 and enforced until 1968. It was named after Will H. Hays. And of course, the next natural question, who was Will H. Hays? William Harrison Hays Sr. was an accomplished man. He was a politician, chairman of the Republican National Committee, U.S. Postmaster General, and the first president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, later known as the MPAA, and now just known as the MPA. Hays was serving in the Harding administration and was peripherally involved in a little scandal called the Teapot Dome scandal. Amidst this, on March 4th, 1922, just a few months after the MPA's founding, Hays resigned from the Harding administration to become the MPA's very first president. Hays was likely selected because of his background. He had financial connections on Wall Street, he had political connections to keep the government out of the film industry, and he quelled the fears of moral corruption by the public because he was an elder of the Presbyterian Church. Hays was selected by a committee of men that included studio heads Adolph Zukor, Louis Selznick, William Fox, Marcus Lowe, Samuel Goldwyn, and my favorite studio head of all, Carl Laemmle. When the MPA was founded, it had two main goals. First, to try to bring greater legitimacy to the film industry to attract Wall Street investments. And second, to try to ensure that films maintained a clean moral tone. The MPAA also instituted a code of conduct for Hollywood actors off-screen to try to avoid scandals there, because Hollywood was coming out of quite a few scandals. They had just experienced the murder of actor William Desmond Taylor and the assault and death of Virginia Rapp by actor Fatty Arbuckle. And at the same time, 37 different states introduced various pieces of legislation trying to censor films. So the industry figured that the simplest way, the best way to get ahead of it, was to take matters into their own hands and censor themselves instead. In 1927, Hayes published a list of 11 don'ts and 26 be carefuls for member filmmakers to follow when making movies. This is still not the code, but we are getting closer to it. And I'm going to spare you the drudgery of going through all of them, but pause here if you'd like to read them yourself. Again, the studios were trying to avoid government intervention, so it was in their best interest to create a set of guidelines that would keep the general public at bay. In 1929, Martin Quigley, the editor of the Motion Picture Herald, and Jesuit priest Father Daniel A. Lord submitted the actual code to studio heads with two major themes. The first prohibited a film from lowering the moral standards of those who see it. They felt that women, children, and the lower class had particularly susceptible minds. They wanted to be sure that films depicted correct standards of life, that they didn't ridicule laws or create sympathy for their violation. The second part was a list of particular applications. And again, I'm not going to bore you with the whole thing, but I'm going to give you a couple headlines and highlights, and you can pause if you want to read the whole shebang. The idea overall was to make sure audiences always know evil was wrong, good was right. So this brings us to the pre-code era, a time when film has sound, the code exists, but it's not really being enforced yet. Once the Great Depression hit, many studios were more concerned with staying alive than they were with adhering to the code. And the first two men tasked with enforcing the code, Colonel Jason Joy and Dr. James Wingate, they were overworked and underenthused with the task at hand. They frankly didn't care that much. So a lot made it past them as the censors. Some film lovers consider the pre-code era one of the most fun eras in all of film history. In this pre-code era, some films pushed the boundaries even more than before. 1932 Scarface has prostitution, incest, and white slavery. Frankenstein famously has the line, "Now I know what it feels like to be God." And the scene where the monster throws the little girl in the lake was only sometimes in some states censored in those earlier years. But then in 1934, that changed because the Catholic Church established the Legion of Decency, threatening to boycott all indecent films, and an amendment was added to the code that established the Production Code Administration. This amendment required all films to get a certificate of approval before their release. Joseph Breen was named the head of the PCA, and he took a hard stance in favor of the code. Suddenly, Breen had the power to change scripts and cut scenes. He alone could prohibit a film from being shown, even for political reasons, like a film that depicted Nazis negatively because it broke a rule about depicting other countries in a negative light, or even if he didn't approve of a film's advertising. Studios could deny making a recommended cut, or they could appeal a rejection by the PCA, but that process usually took years, and the censors were usually going to win anyway. There are some who feel that the code was actually good for the industry, that writers and directors had to use a lot of creativity to get censorable ideas across to audiences. This was a time when they used a lot of double entendres and a lot of innuendo. But others saw the code as really stifling and that it held the industry back from its full power and potential. Horror, for instance, all but disappeared for a couple years in the late 30s. It wasn't until the 1950s that the Hays Code finally found itself on the decline. With more and more Americans getting televisions in their home and TV under stricter censorship guidelines than film, the movie industry wanted to make sure that it could keep its competitive edge and offer something that TV couldn't. Foreign films also posed a threat, and they weren't subject to the code at all. Then finally, in 1952, the Supreme Court overturned its decision regarding the Mutual Film Corporation lawsuit that I mentioned all the way at the beginning of this video. They established that moving pictures were entitled to First Amendment protection, and this meant that the movie industry could stop worrying so much about government regulation. And then, of course, culture was evolving too, so topics that had been taboo in the 20s and 30s weren't such a big deal anymore. And a boycott by the Legion of Decency no longer meant that your film couldn't turn a profit. Throughout the 50s and 60s, films started pushing more and more boundaries that had previously been restricted by the code, and by the late 1960s, the code was abandoned entirely. In its place came the new letter system that we're all familiar with today. So, do you think that the code was an effective way to maintain the morals of Hollywood and Americans? Do you think that the horror genre would be different today if we hadn't had the code? Let me know in the comments below. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Antonia Carlotta. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for bonus content. And thank you so much for watching. It is so good to be back. Bye.